welfare systems. In her position, she is responsible for leading American Humane's initiatives that advance systems and practices to improve outcomes for children and their families. Currently, the two largest initiatives are in the areas of family group decision-making and differential response. Please help me welcome Lisa.
Well, first of all, I just want to, I travel a lot. I've probably been in almost every state in the last 20 years of my professional career, and never have I ever gone to a conference where we start at 8 a.m. and where people actually show up. So it really says something about the Midwestern and Nebraska spirit that you're all here this morning. So I hope to be as energized and as lively as perhaps your minds and your hearts are today. So first, just one quick little adjustment to the introduction, and it's no fault of hers, but there have been a few transitions at the American Humane Association. So what you'll see up on the slide, which just happened as of July 1st. So when all the materials came into the conference team, those changes hadn't yet been made. But so the American Humane Association, many of you will know the history and the roots of that organization, since it was the case of Mary Ellen that really defined, was one of the pinnacle and pivotal to defining moments of the child protection world, I guess, in the United States. And so that obviously was back in the 1800s, 1876. And so American Humane was founded based on the Mary Ellen case in New York, when the little girl, no one had come to her defense, and there were no systems in place to really protect her from harm, but there were systems in place to protect animals. And so for 135 years, American Humane has played a really important role in child protection. So we find ourselves as an organization at a pivotal crossroads with a new board, a new president, and an organization that has desired to go in a different direction. So all of our child protection programs at the American Humane Association, our work in family group decision-making, our work in differential response and outcome measurement, and all sorts of fatherhood, all of our programs have been moved and transitioned to the Kemp Center. Many of you will know who C. Henry Kemp is, also a very important person and an organization that has a great legacy in protecting children. As the American Humane Association decides to pursue a different and more general agenda around children and not be focused in on child protection. So, as of July 1st, the entire team that has worked on child welfare is now over at the Kemp Center, including myself. Although I have not yet started, I did probably the healthiest thing I've ever done in my life, and I took 8 weeks off between positions. So my staff said I wouldn't be able to do it, and I've been pretty effective at not having communication and allowing them to be, just giving them the opportunity to lead as they can do that. So I'm here today to talk about family and what their role is in decision making. And you in Nebraska, which is very similar to a lot of other states, have a lot of different processes in place to engage families at the various pivotal, critical point, decision-making points, and there are many of them in the life of a child welfare case. So what I want you to think about is perhaps what is their role, current role in decision-making along these different processes, and then I want you to think perhaps and push yourself to think what should their role be in child welfare decision-making. And then I want you also to think about what does that word family mean. So as we go through the presentation, I'll try to target a couple of points. There are so many different key decision-making points along the continuum. You have them throughout the court process. There's the decision even to open up the case. There's a decision, or reunification decisions, all sorts of decision to place with whom. So there's so many decisions along the way that you could involve family in these types of processes. And so we want to look at why do we examine, or why should we start examining these types of decision-making points and the role that family play. I want to spend a little bit of time on how might we improve, how might decisions improve if you do engage the wider family system in decision-making. I think throughout the presentation we're going to look at who is that family because in the different processes, you'll see very clearly that some of them are very expansive and some of them are a bit more limiting as to who is involved. And some of that is just because of the time that it oftentimes takes. Okay, that was me and that was bad. So let me turn it off. Which is bad. Somebody ever calls me. All right, sorry about that. It can be more expansive, it can be limiting, and a lot of it is related to the timing of these case decisions, the points that are the case decision points. And then the question that we often ask is, which is a philosophical one and one that people really wrestle with, is should family members be involved? And if so, which family members and who, and how does the role of the paternal family come into play? How deep do you go into the family system? How do you merge the notion of family finding with these different family involvement processes? Does it have any impact on follow-through? And what do we know from some outcome standpoints, from child safety, well-being, permanency? So we're going to try to address many of those as we go through this session. I am planning to leave quite a bit of time for your input and then also questions and answers. And I already told Deb, since she's sitting in the front row, that she can help answer some of the questions, especially if they're a bit Nebraska specific, which I wouldn't necessarily be able to answer as well. So we developed at the American Humane Association a continuum, and it's, I think it's something that we developed a number of years ago, probably needs a bit of revision, especially as there's been such a plethora of models that continue to evolve in this country and elsewhere. I should say that this notion of involving families in decision-making, this is not good, so now I just have to, so now what I'm going to do is, all right. When are you ever needed, right? You're needed right in the middle of a presentation. I'm never needed. My kids never call me. Do you have that experience? They need something, they might text you, but like the verbal communication back and forth sometimes doesn't happen anyway. So of course I'm needed right at this moment. So we think we probably need to think about this a little bit more, especially as the number of countries that are implementing family engagement or family involvement strategies and decision-making continue to grow. Across the world, there are about 22 countries that have documented that this is the direction that they are taking, not only their child protection system, but also their juvenile justice system. So countries like New Zealand and Australia, England, Scotland, Israel, Norway, all the Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Canada, most of the provinces in Canada also have this, are embedding this type of process or processes into different decision-making points. So while there's a landscape change that's happening here in the United States, it really is something that is of a worldwide, phenomenon or notion about the importance of engaging families and how that tends to improve many outcomes for kids and families and then the systems themselves. So if you look at this on the left-hand side of your screen, what you'll see is on the continuum is this notion of family being involved in decision-making and having a much more prominent role. The families, they are actually brought to the table, encouraged to, given all the information that the child welfare system would hold, and are given the opportunity to create initial plans, which are then shared with system providers, and consensus is reached around that plan. Why that's on your left-hand side and at the highest level of the continuum around family voice and decision-making is because they are given the opportunity to meet privately and to be that initial developer of the plan. So then as you go down the continuum along the path to where the system professionals may have more voice in decision-making, you'll see that families are part of a team, and they will be working to create, they'll stay together the whole entire time in a room, and they'll be working to create consensual and acceptable decisions. In the middle, we know that there are a lot of processes where families have a genuine voice at meetings. Their ideas might be sought, perspectives, inputs into what the plan should be, but push come to shove, decision-making still rests with various professionals. We also know that across the landscape, again, not just here in the, in the United States, but elsewhere, there are a lot of meetings where families are invited to. They might be present, but they really have very little input. And that can even, there may be meeting models that are not designed. There might be meeting models that are designed more to be in that middle column, and where people think just by having families there that they're in fact empowered to be decision makers, but it can be very, very challenging unless we take steps and check in with family to make sure that they really truly understand what is happening and that they have a full understanding of information. And oftentimes, when in this fourth column from your left, what oftentimes that means, the code for this one is oftentimes that parents are present, because when extended family systems are present, oftentimes it's a lot harder to marginalize a system than it is to marginalize a parent or two parents. And then, as we know, there still are a lot of meetings that occur, forums that occur, where decisions are made about kids, about families' kids, where family members are not present. So there are all sorts of reasons why a lot of systems have pursued these type of collaborative alternative dispute resolution processes. The first simply is that it increases families' voice in decision making, and I think that plays very nicely into bullets number 2 and 3. And none of us really like to be told what to do, but if we're engaged in a process and we're given information, we're going to have a lot, and we have a role actually in creating what that decision is for probably what most people would deem as the most important treasure in a family system, which are children. You'll see an increased buy-in and less resistance. People are more willing to implement something that they have understand, and B, have invested time in creating. So what the research and literature shows is that very simple paradigm shift, where families are engaged in a very different way, creates more sustainable, long-lasting plans, and plans that seem to result in better permanency for kids. I should also say that one of the other upticks that we see around the country are workers. Child welfare workers, if you look at satisfaction rates, families are oftentimes very satisfied with these different types of engagement processes. But if you look at child welfare workers, they are too, because they carry a huge burden, or they have carried oftentimes a very huge burden by themselves or with their supervisor. They feel very isolated, they feel very accountable for very, very life-changing decisions. And so by being able to share that decision through one of these many processes, that does seem to improve their satisfaction with their role, and also people say it kind of gets back to the core tenets of social work. So we know that people have a better understanding because the information is presented in a way to the families that hopefully is in a much more clear way, because you have a facilitator there who's neutral and independent of the case, I think in almost all of these processes, who's suggesting and making sure and checking in with family to make sure that they understand the information that's being presented, that they have the opportunity to actually challenge the information that's being presented. That comes from New Zealand. And that they have all of the information, because oftentimes families, if you look at some of the literature, families will say that they didn't really understand what was happening. They didn't, especially when as a case progresses through a legal process where it can get very complicated, They didn't always understand the information, and oftentimes for child welfare, it's very hard to present this very difficult information to family members. So sometimes workers might hold back or not be comfortable with disclosing all the information. So this creates some type of accountability so that families have that information. We know from the number of studies that you decrease the amount of time kids are in the system. That comes out of a study out of Miami, Florida, and Washington, D.C. And I think I probably covered the other pieces. I mean, this whole notion of families being responsible for change, with the support of systems that obviously help them make that happen. It's kind of around that notion of self-regulation or the democratic experiment. Who knows what's best for the people themselves, if not those people? And so it's giving them the opportunity, that broader family system, to take responsibility for their children, which is a notion that I think across political aisles, people can agree is actually a pretty good and healthy one. Yes? Sure. So there was a study out of Miami, Florida. It was actually was a court-based family group conferencing project out of Miami-Dade, which showed that kids who received a family group conference had significantly less, or achieved permanency much more quickly than children who did not. So their time in care decreased. I can't remember the exact numbers, but it was a significant finding for that study. And that study was done by the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges, who has for many, many years been very supportive of collaborative decision-making approaches, probably given the fact that Judge Len Edwards was instrumental to family group decision-making kind of coming ashore from New Zealand to the San Jose area, and then obviously his leadership in that organization resulted in a lot of additional courts really looking at this as a court agency partnership that could likely make really significant changes. So we're going to go over each of these, but here are some of the ADR approaches. Some of them are unique to Nebraska. Some of them you may or may not even have. Or it might vary by region, I would imagine, as to what the uptick is on or uptake is on all of these. But you have pre-hearing conferences, family team meetings, family group conferences, which are also known as family group decision-making. Nebraska is unique in the sense of having expedited family group conferences and child dependency mediation. And then you also have these pre-hearing permanency review or TPR conferences. So if I could just ask, I mean, by a show of hands, have all of you been involved in any of these? Okay, so the majority of the audience have probably had some role in one or more of these types of processes. So it'd be good to see kind of what you see in the future as these processes continue to evolve in your state. Let me talk a little bit about some of these models. The Family Group Conference was developed in 1989, probably in New Zealand. It was legislated by the Children, Young Persons, and Their Families Act. It was the first country to formally legislate it as a right for children to have their families come together and plan for them through this process called a Family Group Conference. The word Family Group Conference was what I've learned throughout just knowing some of the people that were principal architects in the development of this legislation is that word group is very intentional. In the United States, oftentimes there's been, as people create hybrids and models, they eliminated the word group. They just call them family conferences or whatever. And the people in New Zealand said they would intentionally put the word group in for a number of reasons, but one was so that there would be the expectation that it would be a group of family and not just a parent or, and it just gives the notion that it is a fuller, larger circle of people coming together. But probably one of the most important things I could mention about the Family Group Conference model and its origins is, in addition to it being legislated, it was really a rising up of the Maori people, the indigenous people of New Zealand, who were experiencing very significant institutional racism across multiple systems, child welfare, juvenile justice, housing. And New Zealand probably is the first government that I've ever known that has actually, in writing, indicated that their child welfare system and their juvenile justice systems were racially biased and were racist. And that they saw the Family Group Conference as one mechanism to combat institutional racism and to replay and to put and to refocus or to create a different context for decision making. If you talk to people from New Zealand, they would say, we believe the context of decision making in child welfare belongs within the family system, and the different systems, government systems that are, surround that family system are to support the family in moving a decision forward. So it's a very monumental shift, really, when you think about it, because when we think even back in our country, the role oftentimes of government, especially when kids get into our systems, is that our systems make the decisions and families might be included. So it really is very, very different. So some interesting origins there, and they reorganized their entire system so that their workers they changed their workforce so that a number of their workers became Family Group Conference coordinators. And I think after 22 years of implementing this, are now, even with legislation, finding that it's very hard to sustain something that is so counter the traditional paradigm. So it'll be interesting to see. They have a new commissioner down in New Zealand who's quite an FGC enthusiast who came from England, and I think it'll be interesting to see what they find as they continue to evolve on their path. There's a model back in Oregon that was developed by caseworkers. It was called the Family Unity Meeting Model. It was an important model back at that time in this country, where there was starting interest in family engagement. That was developed by caseworkers who thought that they could maybe do a better job through a case audit, but perhaps they could do a little bit of a better job if they were engaging families a bit differently. That model you don't hear as much about these days. It has a very facilitated process around trying but it was very monumental in this country because of some of the components of that model of trying to tease out family strengths and needs and concerns in a dialogue process. So there's a group out of Alabama called the Child Welfare Practice and Policy Group. They developed a family team conferencing model. Probably the most unique aspect of that model that I would just point out is that the caseworker is actually the facilitator. So in most of these models, what you'll find is that that usually there's an independent facilitator, somebody who has no connection to the case. It could come from the community. For example, in the Netherlands, they actually have volunteers who serve as facilitators. The joke is, who makes the best conference? Who makes the best conference facilitators? So it's number one, people can develop relationships. So who can develop relationships well with people? So in England, our friends always say it's the taxi cab drivers and the bartenders. And in the Netherlands, it actually truly is the real estate broker, these different people from different walks of professional life who come forward, are trained, and they have over 1,000 volunteer facilitators throughout the Netherlands who will facilitate cases, facilitate family group conferences. So it's interesting, right? So you could have volunteers, you could have professionals from the court who may play the role as a facilitator. Sometimes they sit in community-based organizations, nonprofits. Other times they might sit physically or be funded by the Public Child Welfare Agency, but their role is they're not case carrying for the case that they might be facilitating for. So every state and community does it a bit different. I'm not sure there's any research that shows that one way is better than another, but there are all sorts of, but this notion of independence, I think, is important for many models. The reason the family team conferencing model is a little bit different is they believe that the social worker needs to be the conduit of change. And so if you have a facilitator who's working with the family group, does that diminish the likelihood that that caseworker or that primary social worker will be the conduit of change? And then all around the United States, if you go to Iowa, if you go to South Dakota, I mean, even just when you border, when I think of all the states that border Nebraska, there's so many different models that are being implemented. And so it's always good to ask people, what are those core components of FGC or an FTC or an FUM, because people have generously modified them to meet their cultural context. And sometimes those modifications are good and in keeping with the core principles, and sometimes I think they're a bit of a variation and deviation, which perhaps repositions the system to have more power than oftentimes what was constructed. And then you'll see down here there are these and then in Nebraska you have these expedited family group conferences. And I should say that a lot of the work that Vicki Weiss and Deb Reiner have done over the years, they've been, since 1998, really supporting these notions and all sorts of research and training and public education and probably many other things that I'm unaware of, really working with stakeholders to implement many of these models. And a lot of the research that Vicki did and her team did back in the late 1990s, early 2000s was very pivotal actually to the national movement. So you Nebraskans should be very proud to have such, and I'm sure many of you were involved in that work as well. I should be very proud of how what you did, contributed to the general, improvements nationally. But you have expedited family group conferences, which we'll get to as well. Because the notion of family group conferences, you have to have time to find family. Everybody knows the family finding probably and all those different processes that you might use to find family. But then you have to have time to prepare them, get them to the table, make sure that the process is as family-driven as possible. And that takes time. And in some communities that can take 2 weeks, and in some communities they'll even leave it up to 6 weeks, even 10 weeks for that FGC to occur. So Nebraska was one of the first states to say, could we do a family group conferencing model but expedite it early so that we're doing rapid preparation and finding people as quickly as possible and bringing them together and holding one of these conferences. And then you may have, the Annie Casey Foundation was a pivotal group also in developing a team decision-making model. The reason I raise this is because it is important to think about the genesis and why a model comes into being. So team decision-making was this notion that you had two workers in the same agency. They were both MSWs. They both they went to the same school. They were 1 year apart in age. They were bound by the exact same policies of the agency. And they had different supervisors. So they're in different units. But so, right, their training was the same, their education predominantly probably was the same. They sat with different supervisors, and one worker removed children at a rate 75% more than the other. And so there was an administrator at that point in time in this Ohio county who said, why is that happening? If they're bound by the same policies, they have basically the same education, what's factoring into decision making? I mean, could you argue that, well, worker A just got them much tougher cases, and so worker A just by chance had, but once they, had cases that required placement, or were there some other factors that were leaking into the decision-making process? And it was a notion that a worker and a supervisor really should not make those decisions in isolation. Those are very critical. So they created this team decision-making process, which then really took Ohio by storm, and then the foundations began supporting a very large large family-to-family initiative, and it kind of went throughout many, many states. But what was interesting was when in team decision-making, parents are oftentimes invited. They're held, these meetings are held very quickly. They're held within 24 to 72 hours of a placement decision or any time a placement change might occur. And so being able to rapidly find family, bring them in, can be very challenging at that point in time. But what the developers will say is that the intent was not really to have it be a very large family inclusive model. It was really to hold the system accountable for the decisions that were being made. And so you'd have ongoing intake, you'd have all sorts of different workers around the table in making those decisions. So, but over time, the notion of family being involved in like a team decision-making process, it kind of came more into the conversation, especially as the work of these other models started to infuse that one. There are these family team meetings, which were developed out of Washington, D.C., and some other places, and then obviously there are pre-hearing conferences, which we'll talk about here shortly. So pre-hearing conferences, they're these brief and limited meetings. They're typically held immediately prior to a court meeting. It's my understanding that they last about 35 or 45 minutes, and they're to address the key preliminary issues. You have that independent facilitator, and given that it's right before the court hearing, you're going to have the parent and other key stakeholders present. So have all of you been involved in these pre-hearing conferences? A few of you. The family team meeting, again, they're held within 72 hours of referral. They're used at every juncture around a placement decision. And what we found from our research in Washington, D.C. and helping that system implement is that because of the time nature, they typically have more professionals than family. But what I should say that was interesting about Washington, D.C., and maybe it's just because of their geography and the fact that people in D.C. oftentimes stay in the general vicinity, is they leverage the expertise of their community collaboratives. They have these collaboratives that, for those of you who've been to D.C., that live and breathe in these different neighborhoods in D.C. I think there are like 9 or 10 of them. And they really have become a pulse of the community. And so it was a public-private partnership between the public agency and these collaboratives. The collaboratives actually would do all the coordination they would have these coordinators who go out very rapidly and find family and use all of their kind of background knowledge and of the family systems and the different leaders in the community to bring people together very quickly. And then the agency had an independent facilitator who would facilitate these family team meetings. So family group conference, again, that independent coordinator, which we've talked about how important it is to do preparation. Because of the preparation, because of the intense family finding that exists in a family group conference model, you should have typically more family than professionals in the circle. And a couple of notes just on that, or I guess one note. That can be don't underestimate the difficulty of changing that paradigm for your workforce. It's one thing when we walk into a meeting and you're in a circle and there are 16, or let's just say 8 service providers that you have relationships with, and there are a couple of family members. Change that around where only the most key service providers are there, those with the most pertinent and current information are there, and it's 8 family members who have a range of emotions about their family being involved with the child welfare system. Many people who may or may not fully understand the information. They should know before they get to the meeting all the information, but nonetheless, it can be very difficult. Workers have oftentimes commented that we have not trained them well enough to present the really hard, difficult information to families in a respectful way. And I think it's something that as we implement these processes, we really have to pay attention to, because it does change that paradigm. So private family time is one of those essential elements. It's the third core element that an international committee of people kind of agreed upon when we were thinking, what are those core elements of the family group conference or family group decision making? And this is the notion that often that people will say it's when people with power leave the room and allow the family to take over and begin to plan outside the presence of professionals. So a couple of things that come up. Number one, people are saying, do they hurt each other? Right? I mean, come on, these are some of the things people are thinking, right? Will families hurt each other if you leave them alone? Will they really be able to do it? Can they really make decisions? If they hadn't, how did they even get here? So if they were really engaged in, with their family, then why are they sitting here? Because if they had been engaged before, they maybe could have prevented child from becoming involved anyway. Why would we give them this chance? So there's no national database from family group conferences, probably in any country, that shows whether there's any violence that occurs in these meetings. I will tell you that coordinators really have to do a very careful assessment, and in their preparation processes of meeting with mom and dad's family, will have to sometimes be very creative. That could mean holding a family group conference at a police station or in the community room. It could mean in cases of domestic violence, because this is a model that has been used in cases of domestic violence, it might mean holding 2 separate FGCs. It might mean having somebody on by teleconference. Not necessarily the most optimal strategy, because people can still lob very difficult information into a room, a crowded room, but there are ways that you can work with the family to help them regulate what their process will look like. I remember my first family group conference I ever got to go to was out in California. And it was many, many years ago. I was still the same height, but a lot younger and, really wet behind the ears. And I was critical of this process. I was not necessarily a total believer. And so I went to this meeting or this conference, and the worker said, well, we're going to sit out, we're going to let the family meet on their own, and then we're going to just meet, we'll just sit across the hall. And you tell the family that once they receive, finished making their initial plan to come get you, then you work through the plan to make sure it has, all the T's crossed and the I's dotted, and it's addressed every single concern that the agency has. If it has addressed the concern, then you can go back to private family time, or you can work together consensually to create that plan. So I don't want anybody to leave thinking that there are no accountability mechanisms. It's just an initial step that allows the positions family differently to lead the decision-making process. So there was all this noise coming from, now I come from a Midwestern family, and I'm often told that my mom is pretty loud. And so I'm comfortable with elevated voices at times. But I said, wow, that's seems to be getting really heated in there. And she said, oh, it'll be fine, it'll be fine. And I said, okay, fine. So an hour went by, and kind of the ebb and the flow of the conversation, you could just hear it through the doors. People were coming in, they were slamming the door, they were leaving, they were coming. I was like, wow, this is really intense. And so I said, I said to the woman, I said, do you think you should just maybe go check in on it? And she said, no, you remember what we told them? We told them that when they needed us, they could come find us. And I said, oh, okay. So then after I said that to her, I think she started getting a little nervous, because she was a new conferencing facilitator. And so she ended up, without my prompting, although probably my first question is the reason this happened, she ended up standing up and going and putting her head on against the door. And just as she did that, they opened the door, and she fell into the family group conference. And they looked at her and they said, you didn't trust us. And she said, you're right. I was nervous, I'm new at this, I'm sorry. They said, well, we've got a plan. Somebody went to get drinks, and that's why he left, but we're ready for you to come back in. So the power of family is really important enough, and it's something never to underestimate. And I oftentimes say, because I always think you're one incident away, you're one phone call away of being involved in systems that oftentimes can be very intrusive. And if it were my kids, or your grandkids, or your nieces or nephews, I oftentimes say that I would demand a role at the table. I mean, I'd figure out a way. I'm an advocate. I'm strong. I think I know how the system. Obviously, you're at a bit of an advantage because you know how these multiple complex systems work and oftentimes interact together. But if we would want that and demand that for our own family, kids in our own family, why shouldn't that be a right for other families, especially families who perhaps are a bit more marginalized in society? Yes?
I just can't let this comment go.
I believe the gentleman from the Casey Foundation, was his name Dr. Sanders? He asked us at a plenary, how would you feel if your children were being handled by the system here in Nebraska? And so I think Lisa's just most recent question to us, how would we want our children cared for in this kind of situation? Would we want our sisters and brothers and aunts and uncles and grandparents to be involved in our children's life? I think it's an important question to consider, and one in which engaging that family over the long term seems to me part of the solution. So I just wanted to reference that.
So you also had child dependency mediation in this state. So oftentimes there might be fewer participations in mediation. There's 1 to 3 sessions, 1 to 2 hours each. And you also have, very importantly, the independent trained mediator who plays a pivotal role in that process. And again, that can be used at any point in the life of the case. I should say that on your flash drive, there are a number of different handouts related to child protection mediation and family group decision making and other family engagement models. That if you're interested, there's some very nice short one-piece, one-page handouts that really lay out all the different models in Nebraska. And then there's guidelines, I think, on child protection mediation as well as on family group decision making, and our 2-pager on family group decision making, which might be good reference points for you as you go forward. There's a group of very committed professionals who spend about 3 years, I would say almost about 3 years, developing these child dependency mediation guidelines. And it was a national group, and Deb played a role and other people played a role as well. But coming together to really think through dependency mediation as it moves into the future, since there is a lot of variation across the states. So where does everything lie on the continuum? So our TDM and family team meetings oftentimes are more on the professionally driven are seen as more family infused process, probably because of their origins, and again, because of their time, the time pressures in developing them. We oftentimes say you can't stop at a TDM. You can't stop at a TDM or an FTM if you really want to engage families. You could, and a number of systems are starting to do this, use the family team meeting and use a team decision-making meeting or use an expedited FGC to actually plan for the larger family system coming together. When done well through the research, you will get, on average, 13 family members to the table. And think about all those eyes and ears. Think about the different resources that would become available. One of the other benefits of these conferencing processes is that families generate a lot of resources, which given our economy and the difficulty that a lot of systems have right now in having flexible resources and services available, to have the uncle providing transportation instead of a respite, having somebody within the family providing some type of respite instead of a formal service. Families, it's not that the number of resources that you might need change. I don't want you to think that you have these family meetings and families have no needs. Of course they do, but who meets those needs can be much more of a partnership between a larger family system and service systems. The FGC on the other side is seen at this point in time as the most family-driven, professionally infused process because of the energy and time and commitment to family finding and bringing people together, giving the information and letting them lead. You see the pre-hearing hearing conferences as more of a court-driven process, one that also is professionally infused. And then child dependency mediation is very open-ended. I think it can go at any along any part of the continuum. It just really depends upon the situation at hand, the concern that is being mediated, and probably the skill of the mediator they may have. So here is, as you can see, what happens. It's just a sample flow chart. It doesn't mean that it always works this way, but this could look familiar to many of you, especially since you all mentioned that you have a role, or have had a role in a number of different processes. So you have an initial removal of a child. What I should also say, just interestingly enough, before I get to this slide, is that there is a movement in this country to start holding a variety of different family meetings for kids who are receiving in-home services. So while probably most of the models have, because we don't have resources to provide these family meetings for all families, because our systems haven't been reoriented in that way, so you're going to have a target population. And most states or most counties have targeted families who have children who have been removed and are living in some form of out-of-home care. But there is a movement to start looking at how can we embed family meetings for these families that are receiving in-home services. And we're in fact involved in a three-site study in South Dakota, Texas, and Laramie County, Colorado, which is Fort Collins, to really measure what are the impacts of offering family meetings for that specific population of families. It should be interesting. We've got one randomized control trial that's happening and another quasi-experimental design for another. And we're really targeting a lot of Native American children in South Dakota, which, as you know, has really struggled with its disproportionality rates with that target group of kids. So you have an initial removal of a child, then on day one, you're going to have your intake, you're going to do your assessment, right, and safety plan. Moved by between day one and week one, your petition is going to be filed by your county attorney, you've got your attorneys appointed, and then you have your pre-conference hearing, which we talked about was, done 30 to 45 minutes before that, before the hearing. And then, as you see, it can kind of move. You can go down to a protective custody, then you go down to your protective custody hearing, you can go to an expedited FGC, then you have these family team meetings, which can happen same day, or family meetings which might happen a different day, and then at the very end of the continuum, if you use these other processes, you can use them as a way to start preparing for the broader family conference. So I'm sure there are many other machinations as to how this flows for you all. And then you, of course, have your, you also have your pre-hearing conference facilitation, which happens, 60 days prior to 12 months of your permanency review hearing, court hearing. So there's all sorts of ways that you can, or different processes that you have in place to engage families in decision-making in this state. You should be applauded for that, because you are in some ways, much further ahead than many of your counterparts around the country. And so the question is, how can you build on the strength that you already have, the talent, the expertise, in your different systems, to perhaps even push it a little further and engage families in a more systematic way throughout the life of the case. So with that, I'm going to open it up for questions and dialogue, and I wasn't sure if I needed to take the microphone to people. Do you know? Okay. Even if I wanted to, I don't think I can. I think I'm stuck. So it's 8 to 8. Anybody have a burning question, a comment, anything that's happening in Nebraska that you think is important to share with your colleagues? Yes?
I guess my frustration with on the part of this is that it seems to be outside the norm. That I think that case managers and everyone on the ground ought to be thinking this way, working this way, that we shouldn't necessarily have to pay somebody outside or find a contract or work out a way to get a facility to do this. So certainly with pre-hearing conferences, I think we've all taken it upon ourselves and we've found people and worked it out. But if we're going to really work with families, it needs to start with the skills of the case managers right on the front line. And I think that's really hard for young workers to do, because you have to have the authority and the ability to work with a family who are hostile and uncooperative and afraid. And I think the skill level of workers that we need is, I just want to reach out to them and say, this is doable, and I want us to be doing it, but I'm sort of frustrated that somehow this is, it's all somehow outside the mainstream still. And I wonder what other people feel in that.
I'd say, like, with regard to the family group conference, there's a specific skill set that goes with mediating and facilitating, getting people getting people from North Dakota into Nebraska for a group conference, and then facilitating that whole dynamic of the family coming up with their own plan. I think the department's workers do that kind of on a more of a less formal basis in their monthly family team meetings, and that they know how to engage families and they're trained on how to do that stuff. But when it comes to like family group conference, it takes a more specialized skill set to facilitate something like that.
And with the neutral mediator, I've done just the pre-permanency hearings quite a few times. It takes that, because as a case manager, I mean, if we've made it to the pre-permanency hearing, we have a relationship, and it's not always positive, obviously. So to me, I mean, I have found very much value that it has gotten us to permanency much quicker by bringing it all to the table. But they do have a skill set. You know, they also have that agenda. I mean, they know how to keep them on task. And there's not that emotion connected with the mediator. Like there is. Yeah, they're neutral. They just are neutral. You're right. I mean, they're able to just bring everybody's opinions in, and they don't let arguments happen. And, you know, they're able to do that. So that would, I see that benefit on that end, but I have not done the on the front end.
And I see lots of value to it. As someone knows how to make it central to our thinking, as opposed to something you bring in or pay for extra.
You raise a really important point, and that's why I think the people out of Alabama actually created that model. In Iowa, I think is very similar. They also have their caseworkers who facilitate their own processes. So how do you embed the knowledge and skills in a workforce which is typically pretty young and burns out actually fairly quickly? Because it is very complicated. It can be very energizing and invigorating work but it can be very complicated to navigate family systems. And you also have to think that a lot of people are not coming out of, from an education standpoint, not a lot of people come out of university with being steeped in family systems theory, too. I mean, it's seen a little bit more as an individual client piece. So I think, and group work, you know, how do we teach people if they haven't had coursework, and has our training been revamped to help people know how to do group work differently, too? So there's all sorts of pieces there. But I think the other piece that, in addition to having somebody who's neutral and independent of the case, one of the reasons that that independent facilitator, coordinator was developed out of New Zealand and I think then spread across the world was this notion that you have to have somebody who actually can hold the system accountable too. And somebody who can make sure that the worker has put all the information on the table, who can tease out information from system providers in a way. So the person has to really understand, obviously, a lot of system issues to do it. Yes, Brian.
I was just thinking, they used to do the wraparound model, some of you probably remember that the caseworkers did do a lot of the coordinating family meetings, but that's a lot of training and a lot of time, and then this is all skyrocketed. But I'm concerned about making sure that they have all of the training time they needed, so, reduce training time and should expand.
Talking about expanding, if everybody heard the comment, it's just this notion of expanding training time. And I think one of the things that we've learned is that some of the training strategies that we've used are perhaps a bit outdated. So having workers or coordinators or whatever you're going to call them, being able to shadow people over time may be actually a more effective training strategy than, you know, classroom-based training. Obviously, you have to have a little of both, but this notion of shadowing and mentoring and coaching, while it's a more intensive, time-intensive strategy, shows to be that it might make some more higher-level, long-lasting impacts in the workforce. Yes,
Can
Deb?
you talk a little bit about findings over time and why engaging families?
Sure. First, I would just suggest to everyone, while we're moving our National Center on Family Group Decision Making to the Kemp Center, there's a great website still on the American Humane website. It's www.f for Frank, G for gorilla, D for dog, M for whatever we'd like to make up M to be monkey. .org, so fgm.org, and on that website are a list of resources, and one is an annotated bibliography of all the research to date on family engagement. It'll tell you the key findings by study. Some of them are about family team meetings, child protection and mediation, family group conferencing, family unity, whatever. I mean, all the different models, and it showcases literature from around the world. So again, increased permanency for kids, reduction in reabuse rates. We also saw increases in family safety. There was one study out of Newfoundland and Labrador, Canada, which showed significant decreases so improvements in family functioning and decreases in issues of substance abuse, family violence, and those types of things. When you can bring a wider circle around, oftentimes these are secrets in families. I mean, you think that everybody knows, but really, they oftentimes do not. So by bringing that wider circle around, you're able to create a bit of a different check and balance system and encourage the family system to play a role in that. So those would be the major findings to date. And there are more coming out because the federal government has funded a range of studies in this area. So I'm going to get the book. I cannot believe how many people were here. I really thought there'd be 5 in the audience. You guys are like very, I mean, you embody the Nebraska, the Midwest, work ethic, hardcore, very strong. So I'll remember this for a very long time when I'm sitting somewhere at 9 o'clock and there's no one there. So I wish you the rest of a successful conference. You've got Ashley Rhodes Porter coming up as your keynote speaker. She is wonderful, very entertaining, and has quite a story. So please, if you can, do stick around for her. She'll make you cry and make you think as well. So